Gracias. Gracias por venir esta tarde, pero mi español es muy malo. Lo siento. So I will speak in English. You don't want to hear my terrible Spanish. But I do want to thank everyone here, and I want to thank the Friends of the Prado. It's a superb institution. You've done such good work, and it's a great privilege to be at the Prado, which I think, as an objective observer, this is the greatest museum in the world. Today, we are familiar with many images drawn from the narratives of the Gospels, the birth of Christ, baptism, miracles performed by Jesus, and the Passion, as well as depictions of the Virgin, saints, and the Acts of the Apostles. Most of these representations derive from medieval compositions, both in the West, most prominently in Rome, and in the East, in Constantinople. Ultimately, they follow the models of the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great and his sons in the 4th century AD. It was Constantine who served as the most prominent patron of the fledgling church, not only legitimizing Christianity, which, although with many converts even among the Roman aristocracy, still suffered persecution, but he also paid for the sumptuous decoration of newly built churches and centers of pilgrimage in Rome, in his new capital, Constantinople, and in the Holy Land. Ancient historians record, for example, churches filled with wall paintings, mosaics, and even full-size silver figures of Christ, angels, and apostles that decorated the Lateran Basilica in Rome. Unfortunately, although many of the churches still stand, notably in Rome, including the Lateran Basilica and St. Peter's, little of the original decoration of the churches survives. Santa Pudenziana, a very ancient church, rebuilt by Constantine, was decorated with spectacular mosaics. Somewhat later than his time, around 420 AD. The church of Santa Costanza, by tradition, built as a mausoleum for his daughter Constantina in AD 354, contains mosaics of a grape harvest, and also the image of Christ greeting Peter and handing him the laws, signifying the divine endorsement of apostolic succession and the authority of the church, which was a preoccupation of the 4th century. There were once mosaics in the dome, now lost, but still visible in the 16th century when they were drawn by Francesco d'Olanda. I show this mostly because this is in the Escorial. It's not very well known, but it's really fantastic preservation of the now lost images in the apse, which show a mixture of aquatic scenes interspersed with biblical scenes, including Susanna and the elders, Tobias, the sacrifice of Cain and Abel, the sacrifice of Elias on Mount Carmel, Moses striking the rock, and possibly even Noah building the ark. The juxtaposition of episodes from the Old and New Testament was carefully considered by theologians. Early Christian theologians, steeped in Jewish tradition, read Old Testament stories as allegories of salvation and prefigurations of Christ and his teachings. It was of the greatest importance to see the Old and New Testaments as unified and then superseded by Christianity. Figures such as Jonah and Isaac, both redeemed from death, were seen as symbols for Christ. Writing around the year 200, long before Constantine, the North African theologian Tertullian observed, Isaac, when led by his father as a victim and himself bearing his own wood, was even at that early period pointing to Christ's death. This is from Tertullian's Adversus Judaeus. Jonah was an especially popular figure and served multiple symbolic functions as a symbol of redemption from death, baptism, having been redeemed by the water, and a prefiguration of Christ for his 3 days in the belly of the great fish before salvation, a comparison made by Jesus himself in reference to his resurrection. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 12:40. These biblical figures are characteristic of the earliest Christian art, notably in their allegorical or exegetical interpretations, but there are also symbolic images, most notably the fish and the good shepherd, to which I will return. This sort of imagery is rare in the decoration of Constantine's churches and those that came afterward, reflecting the changing interests of the church at the time to emphasize Christ's life and miracles and the primacy of the church and its bishops. But these early allegorical images are characteristic of the earlier Christian art. And it's this earlier allegorical Christian imagery which originated before the time of Constantine that I would like to examine today. What are the earliest Christian images? Where were they made and why? Little survives of these formative years to guide us. And for this reason, my approach is very much archaeological. I'm sort of speaking as an archaeologist, trying to understand events from a small number of scattered and sometimes unique objects, guided by the writings of the early church fathers. Only a few monuments found scattered around the vast empire, and usually quite humble, remain to provide clues to the beliefs and aspirations of the early Christians. One must look to the religion's origins in the Holy Land, for the religion began as a small sect of Judaism in the Roman province of Judea, modern-day Israel and Palestine, a region where little is known of artistic representations of the various religious beliefs. Whether the Jews of the first century used biblical imagery is a matter of considerable debate, to which I will return, but certainly nothing survives. Some modern scholars suggest that Jewish theological books, commentaries on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, which in itself was certainly not illustrated, but these commentaries might have included pictures, but no such illustrated books survive. However, the discovery in 1932 of a 3rd century AD Jewish synagogue at Dura Europos in eastern Syria revolutionized our understanding of both Jewish and Christian art. The city of Dura Europos served primarily as a Roman garrison at this time, placed strategically on the border of the Roman Empire, the border with the Parthian Empire, the Persians. An inscription dates the last phase of decoration of the synagogue to the year AD 244. The city was conquered by the Parthians a short time later in 256, and then abandoned, leaving the city preserved as it was in the mid-3rd century, with a diversity of temples decorated with painted images. In addition to the synagogue, there were shrines to Greek and Syrian gods and the Persian god Mithras. There was also a Christian house church, perhaps the earliest known Christian building anywhere, also with painted decoration. The synagogue, which I show here reconstructed in the Damascus National Museum, it's fairly large, measuring 15 by 5 meters, shows how rich and complex Jewish biblical imagery could be and how difficult it is to interpret. Brightly painted panels placed in 3 horizontal registers show biblical figures and episodes, among them the sacrifice of Isaac, the finding of Moses in the burning bush, Aaron in the temple, episodes from the story of Elijah, the anointing of King David, and scenes from the book of Esther. Depictions of the Ark of the Covenant are prominent, no doubt signifying the importance of God's teachings, as are pictures of the temple in Jerusalem and the holy menorah of the seven-branched candlestick. But the scenes do not form a chronological narrative and could not have been used to illustrate, for example, the weekly readings of the Bible. They're not in any kind of order. More likely, they served an exegetical purpose. The rabbi would have been able to point to the stories, to use them for instruction, perhaps in the manner of Talmudic discussion. There are strong parallels here to the teachings of early Christian theologians as well. There is, in fact, a Christian house church at Dura as well. This has been moved to Yale University in America, to their art museum, and reconstructed there. The paintings are again allegorical and not always clear in their meaning. Above the baptismal font here, this panel is the Good Shepherd, which is understandable. It's often a symbol associated with baptism. Less so are the women approaching a tomb, presumably the tomb of Christ, the sepulcher, the Holy Sepulcher, although why it's in this context, we don't know. And they're also there's a scene up above, a fairly rare image of Christ and Peter walking on water from Matthew book 14, in a large register above. And there are small images, which you can't really see on the slide, of Adam and Eve and David and Goliath. Why these? This has been much debated, and I cannot say, but the similarities to the synagogue decoration are notable, where images are juxtaposed without a clear narrative. The discoveries at Dura Europos were startling for their relatively early date, showing that an extensive range of pictorial images illustrating both the Old and New Testament was in existence before the middle of the 3rd century, a century before Constantine. Little else comparable survives, but often overlooked, I believe, is a series of bronze coins, of all things, minted at the city of Apamea in Phrygia, which is modern-day dinar in western Turkey. Slightly earlier than the Dura Europos synagogue, they were first struck during the reign of Emperor Septimius Severus, who ruled 193 to 211, and continued for several decades to be issued at this mint. This one I'm showing you is from the Emperor Macrinus, so datable exactly to 217, 218. Provincial Roman mints like this, like Apamea, often shows local themes for their coins. And according to one Jewish tradition, Apamea was the site of Mount Ararat, where, according to the Bible, Noah's Ark came to rest after the flood. The reverse of the coin here shows two scenes from the biblical account. On the right, we have Noah and his wife in the box-like ark, afloat on waves, which are shown below, wavy lines, on which perches a dove. The ark is labeled in Greek, Noah, so there can be no doubt about the identification of the scene. On the left, the dove has returned to the ark with a branch of olive. Genesis 8:10 to 11. And Noah and his wife, now outside the ark, offer thanks to God. The coin is remarkable evidence for the existence of Jewish illustrations of the Bible. Where did it come from? Jewish communities in this region are well attested, but did they produce images of biblical stories? Was there another synagogue with painted walls like Dura Europos? Perhaps, but two consecutive scenes following the biblical account suggest a more extensively illustrated Bible. Some scholars, indeed, notably the great Kurt Weitzman, a German refugee to America before World War II, his dates are 1904 to 1993, have argued for the existence of extensively illustrated Bibles which no longer survive. And although the theory is somewhat out of fashion these days, I feel it must be correct. The most important surviving illustrated book dates only from the later 5th century. The so-called Cotton Genesis in the British Library in London, written in Greek and probably produced in Egypt. It once had more than 350 illustrations of Genesis alone, distributed over 221 pages. Preserved throughout the Middle Ages, it was this book that served as the source of the 13th century mosaics on the Basilica of San Marco in Venice, before being purchased by Sir Robert Cotton in England in the 17th century. Tragically, it was severely damaged in a fire in 1731, but enough survives to give an idea of the extent of the illustrations. Here's one of these sorry, burnt pages, this in the British Library, of Lot's encounter with the Sodomites, Genesis 19. And this is a 17th century copy, watercolor copy, accurate copy made of the creation of the plants, Genesis 1:11 to 12. It's notable that there are Christianizing elements here, such as Christ taking the place of God in the creation. Books such as this, likely influenced by Jewish tradition or Jewish models, would have served to spread early Christian imagery throughout the empire. The evidence for the existence of Jewish and Christian images in the 2nd and 3rd centuries is little indeed, but just enough to demonstrate that it did exist and was highly sophisticated. How extensively did these images proliferate in the Christian communities of the Roman Empire? Both Jewish and early Christian theologians were concerned about the very use of images. Perhaps they're cautious of the biblical prohibition of graven images, shall not create graven images, but I think primarily to avoid what was believed to be the immorality of their pagan neighbors and to protect their own smaller religions, their own integrity from being contaminated by pagans. Pagan images considered inappropriate could be seen everywhere in their communities, and they had to be careful of this. Interesting evidence for the careful thought given to what images might be appropriate and acceptable comes from the earliest seal rings of the Christians. Seals, usually engraved on gemstones, were a necessity in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, used to mark official documents and household goods. The early church father Clement, head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, Egypt, wrote the following around the year 200. Shows the careful thought given to this. He said, "Let our seals be either a dove or a fish or a ship running with a fair wind or a musical lyre or a ship's anchor. And if the seal is a fisherman, it will recall the apostle and the children drawn out of the water. For we are not to depict the faces of idols, we who are prohibited from attaching ourselves to them, nor a sword, nor a bow, since we follow peace, nor drinking cups, since we are temperate. Many of the licentious have their lovers engraved, or prostitutes, as if they wish to make it impossible ever to forget their erotic passions by being continually reminded of their licentiousness." The passage demonstrates the theological concerns of how Christians should take part in a broader pagan society. It's an attempt to address the problem of imagery seen all around. No Christian seals from the time of Clement, around 200 that is, can be identified, perhaps, as the passage suggests, because they were carefully chosen from existing pagan imagery. A generation or so later, however, there are seals with distinctively Christian designs on the gems in the same manner as pagan seals, probably made by pagan artists, the same people who made them. The first gems, dating from the early 3rd century, rarely show images, perhaps deliberately so. They bear only inscriptions in Greek, usually naming Jesus or Christos, Jesus Christos. Some have the monogram composed of the Greek letters chi and rho, the first two letters of Christos. This is the symbol that was said to have been seen by Constantine in a vision before his decisive victory over the usurper Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in Rome in the year 312. The contemporary Christian writer Lactantius, I'll show you from the time of Constantine, the Christian writer Lactantius, who is a contemporary of this event, relates the story, and we can be reasonably certain that Constantine did credit this symbol with his victory, with the divine assistance and his victory. And the image became a personal symbol of imperial power, as you can see from this silver plate. This is the letters chi and rho. But on gems, nearly a century earlier, the beginning of the 3rd century, they are humble symbols engraved on a little carnelian ring gem set in a ring. Most have been found in the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Turkey, Syria, although this example was found in a Roman fort in Hungary, probably brought there from Syria by a Christian soldier. Two other early symbols are of special importance. The first is the fish, in Greek ichthus, which is an acrostic, the first letters of ichthus for the Greek Jesus Christos Theou Huios Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Already in the Gospels, the symbol of the fish was present. The apostles were fishers of men. In Mark, Jesus performs the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fish in Matthew and Mark. The symbol has deep significance, referring to Christ himself, as well as these episodes in the New Testament and allegorically baptism and the Eucharist. Some seals, such as this one I'm showing, bear the ichthus inscription and introduce an image of two fish flanking an anchor, a traditional pagan image that has been appropriated by the early Christians and given new meaning. So it's in this way that they adapted what they saw around them to make them Christian. Early evidence of the Greek-speaking Eastern Christians coming to Rome and bringing their new symbols can be found in this tombstone, marble tombstone of Licinia Amias, is her name, discovered in 1841 in the vicinity of the Vatican Cemetery, one of the oldest Christian cemeteries. Although of traditional pagan shape and design, especially, this was probably pre-made, the top with the wreath and the DM for dis manibus, to the sacred spirits of the dead, a pagan acclamation, the Christian symbol of fish and anchor is added, along with the Greek ichthus again. And here it's ichthus zonton, which is fish of the living, signifying not only the acrostic for Christ, but also a reference to Matthew and Mark, which say, he is not God of the dead, but of the living. The second highly popular image was the Good Shepherd, an explicit reference to Jesus, for in John 10:11, Jesus states, I'm the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And Christian theologians, such as Tertullian again, very early ones, he's unequivocal in explaining the verse. He says, but a sheep is properly a Christian, and the Lord's flock is the people of the church, and the Good Shepherd is Christ. Another of Jesus' parables tells that when the Good Shepherd has found a lost sheep, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. This is Luke 15:5. And it is this composition with the Good Shepherd Christ facing frontally and carrying the sheep over his shoulders that the early Christians chose as their emblem, and it's almost always shown in this pose. He's frequently seen in the wall paintings that decorated the catacombs in Rome, such as this one, dating from the mid to the late 3rd century, and often on seal rings of the same date, most of which are from the east, from Syria and Asia Minor. There's a tantalizing mention by Tertullian again, writing about 200 AD in Carthage, of drinking cups decorated with the Good Shepherd, but none of these survive. There is, however, a clay oil lamp found probably in Rome in the late 17th century and now in Berlin that provides our earliest evidence. It prominently displays, and I'm showing you here the actual lamp in Berlin in a late 17th century engraving by Bellori, where you can probably see the details better. It prominently displays the Good Shepherd in the middle, but also includes subsidiary little figures of Noah's Ark. Here's the Ark of Noah with a dove on it, and Jonah, spit out by the whale, by the great fish here, and asleep under the gourds here at Nineveh. Clearly, this can only be a Christian object. It's stamped on underneath with the name of its maker. It's the Florentius Workshop, which was a prolific maker of oil lamps, all stamped with different designs, all of which are pagan, though, probably in Rome in the early 3rd century. So this must have been made for the small number of Christian clients in Rome. It demonstrates not only the interest among Christians in displaying their images, but the scope of these allegorical themes: shepherd, Noah, Jonah. These biblical images function symbolically at many levels, alluding to personal salvation, as prefigurations of Christ, as references to baptism or the Eucharist, and to eternal life. Another unique piece of evidence for understanding the significance of early Christian imagery is this. This is a glass bowl, probably a bit later in date, 4th century, discovered in modern-day Podgorica in Montenegro, and now in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. The biblical and apocryphal images include the central figure of Abraham and Isaac here, surrounded by Adam and Eve, Jonah, Susanna, several episodes of Daniel in the fiery furnace and in the lion's den. This is an apocryphal story of Peter and the raising of Lazarus here, Christ raising Lazarus. What's especially interesting here is the Latin inscriptions, which are particularly important. They're related to an early Christian prayer for the dead, the commendatio animae, the commendation of the soul, which asks for salvation in the manner granted to biblical figures. Each line begins, Libera Domine animum eius sicut liberasti. Deliver, Lord, his soul, just as you delivered, and then lists all of these figures: Enoch, Elijah, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Moses, Daniel, Susanna, and others. Similarly, the inscriptions on this glass bowl refer to the salvation of these figures. In the center, we have Abraham and Isaac. Around Jonah, as I mentioned, where it says, Divan de ventri queti liberatus est. Jonah is delivered from the belly of the sea. Daniel from the lion's den. The 3 youths from the fiery furnace. Susanna from the false charge, and so on. So it's quite explicitly redemption. By around 300 AD, the same imagery was being used on carved marble sarcophagi. These are objects of considerable cost, indicating an increasingly wealthy Christian class. They are products primarily of Rome, and although also sometimes made and found in France, Germany, Spain, and North Africa, they're rare in the East, rare in Assyria and Asia Minor, where these earlier works I talked about came from, until a later date. Typically, they show shepherds and idyllic scenes of paradise in a pagan manner, but some hint at the lost tradition of biblical illustration, which I'm trying to find here. For example, a sarcophagus preserved in the Abbey of St. Matthias in Trier, Germany, now moved to the Rheinisches Landesmuseum in that city, dates from around 300 to 310, And it was no doubt carved locally, not an import from Rome. It displays a remarkably detailed rendering of Noah's Ark, here again in this box-like ark, but full of the whole family, Noah's wife and children, many animals standing on the rim, the dove flying back, the raven who returned without the finding land. So all following the biblical account quite closely. It's more complex than the numerous examples of Noah, simple ones of him in a box that we see in the catacombs, and recalls, I think, the coin I showed you, the coin of Apamea, with its narrative intent. What was the source for this image? A book? A painted synagogue or church? Another famous sarcophagus, discovered in the Vatican Cemetery in Rome in the 16th century, is wonderfully composed with a pair of curling sea monsters in the center. These are the great fish that swallowed Jonah. Here he's being thrown out of the boat to the waiting mouth of the sea monster. This is in the form of the ancient Greek sea monster known as the Ketos. Here he's being spit out again and then asleep under the gourds at Nineveh. That's the main image on the sarcophagus. In addition, there are other little images, if you can see them. Here's Noah on the ark, Christian ones as well, raising of Lazarus, Peter escaping from prison with the aid of the angel, and shepherds and fishermen. There are a good number of Christian sarcophagi with a variety of biblical scenes in Rome, dating mostly from the 4th century, a little later. This is probably the earliest of them. But during the time of Constantine, they were fashionable. But there's reason to believe that the earlier sculptural representations of these sort of images were also well known. It's just that the evidence is very thin. Few examples survive, but a stunning discovery was made in the early 1960s. Oh, this is sort of a typical Jonah scene from the catacombs, thrown from the ship, spit out again by the sea monster and under the gourds. This is the discovery. The circumstances are unfortunately unknown, but a group of marble statuettes were found somewhere in southwestern Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and eventually sold to the Cleveland Museum of Art in America. They perhaps decorated the garden of a private home or even a tomb. There were 3 pairs of portrait busts of an aristocratic Roman couple, man and wife, closely datable by their hairstyles, very fashionable hairstyle, to the years around 280 to 290. So slightly earlier than the Christian sarcophagi from Rome. With these busts were 5 small figures, about half a meter in height, of very, very good quality, representing the Good Shepherd, as you can see, and the story of Jonah. Here Jonah is standing in prayer with the hands outstretched. These rather remarkable images of being swallowed by the classical Ketos sea monster and spit out again, and then asleep under the gourds, just as we see in the catacomb paintings. As I mentioned, the quality of the workmanship is superb, and the multiple sculptures illustrating the narrative suggest that such groups were already widely displayed throughout the Roman Empire by the late 3rd century, if not earlier, and certainly long before Constantine. It's also notable that the story of Jonah was typically shown as this series of episodes. Basically, rather than a single image, where everything else, it could have been reduced to a single image, but it's 3 or more. But the 3 key elements are Jonah thrown from the ship to the waiting monster, spit out again, and asleep under the gourds. But further scenes were sometimes admitted, such as Jonah in prayer, as I just showed, Why was the story of Jonah told episodically when other biblical stories were not? What was the source? I think, again, a book illustration is most likely. Remember that the book of Jonah is very short. It's very brief. And these 3 or 4 episodes could easily be shown on a single page, in the margins or just in a panel. Furthermore, in Jewish tradition, Jonah was read, as it still is today, on the solemn holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and thus had a very prominent place in Jewish teaching. In the 1950s, the Swedish scholar C.O. Nordstrom suggested that a depiction of Noah on this kind of very beautiful ivory casket in Brescia, in Italy, which is detailed, again, in the typical manner of juxtaposing Old and New Testament scenes, Christ's teaching, and it's a very interesting object. But Jonah is quite prominent here, being thrown out of the boat and spit out by the sea monster. But it's a very elaborate boat, and this is what Nordstrom said. There are very deliberately 6 sailors in the boat, in addition to Jonah. And he suggested this can be explained by that it reflects a Jewish tradition, which is in Jewish early commentaries, the Midrash Yonah and the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, that the ship allegorically represents the 70 nations of the world, each with its own god. Thus, 7 figures. This story is not in the Bible, but may well derive from another illustrated book of commentary. The theory has been controversial, but I think there can be no doubt that there is a tradition of illustrations based on extra-biblical beliefs, mostly ultimately Jewish, although often continued by Christian theologians. There's another example. I'm getting more complicated here. There's another example, because I've always wondered about this piece. Not this one. I'll get to more on this idea of Jonah and these images of Jonah. Going back to the gems of the 3rd century, even on these tiny little gems, we have the entire Jonah cycle depicted. I just show it both color and black and white. You might see better in the black and white. Here, he's thrown out of the boat to the waiting great fish. He's spit out, and he's asleep under the gourd. But we have a new scene here, one that isn't seen anywhere else. An angel is approaching him on the shore, carrying a cloak to cover him. This is very unexpected. It may refer to the extra-biblical Jewish tradition, which is mentioned in the Midrash Yonah, that Jonah's hair and clothes were consumed in the belly of the sea monster. And indeed, Jonah is typically shown naked in all the Christian images of this time, such as the catacomb paintings and sarcophagi. But the angel bringing him a cloak, bringing him clothes to cover him, is not attested in any surviving literary source. And in fact, I've only found one other comparison, and it's a much later one. This is an early 15th century Persian illustration where the angel is bringing a cloak to Jonah. These illustrations were used for teaching as well. I cannot explain the parallel other than as a literary survival from Jewish teaching through Arabic to Persian. The source has not yet been discovered. Finally, I'd like to return to another puzzle. Because as we go back to these early times, we just, as I mentioned, just fragments of what survived. But the indications are that there was a lot, and it was very sophisticated. One of the great puzzles of early Christian iconography is the rarity of depictions of the crucifixion. Despite the centrality of the cross and crucifixion to Christian belief, the image is not found in the catacombs or on early sarcophagi. It only becomes conventional in the early Byzantine period, that is, the 6th century. and only as part of narratives of the life and miracles of Christ, usually in that context. Here on the late 6th century Syriac Rabula Gospels in Florence. And this is typically how it's shown, Christ and the thieves crucified. The use of the cross itself as a prominent symbol is not attested before the mid-4th century, late in the Constantinian period. And the wearing of crosses around the neck is not cited in literature until the 4th century, and I don't think any survive until probably the 6th century. Earlier narrative cycles did exist, however, dating from the 5th century. The carved wooden doors of the Church of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill in Rome again include Old and New Testament scenes juxtaposed. It's a remarkable survival. If you haven't seen this in Rome, it's really quite amazing. It does date from the 5th century. The message seems to be quite complex, emphasizing the miracles and divinity of Christ, but among them is the crucifixion, which I show you here. Of similar date are 4 beautifully carved ivory panels, probably from a reliquary box in the British Museum, with very detailed episodes from the Passion and Resurrection. Here, Christ before Pilate, carrying his cross, denial of Peter. On the other panel, the suicide of Judas, and the crucifixion itself. The 2 other panels, which I won't show you, are afterwards. It's the empty sepulcher and the doubting of Thomas. They probably, as I say, they probably ornamented a reliquary box, and they follow the gospel account fairly well. And for this reason, I think they probably do derive from an illustrated gospel book. But again, there is earlier evidence that suggests the tradition was more complicated. First, there is this. This is a graffito scratched into the plaster wall of the servants' quarters in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome, dating from the beginning of the 3rd century. A man is shown raising his hand toward a crucified, ass-headed figure on a cross. The Greek inscription reads, Alexamenos worships God. The tradition that the Jews worship the statue of an ass is related by the Roman historian Tacitus and must have been applied to Christians as well, for it was refuted by Tertullian around the year 200. The graffito appears to refer to this popular belief, mocking a Christian worshiping an ass-headed God. This strongly suggests to me the possibility, at least, that there were actual Christian images of the crucified Jesus that could be seen in Rome at this date. Further evidence for the existence of pictures of the crucifixion at an early date comes from yet another unique object. Again, on color in black and white. This is an engraved gem, first published in 1964 in a private collection and then later acquired by the British Museum in 1986. The bloodstone gem shows a naked, bearded Jesus with legs splayed, tied to a cross. Inscriptions cover both sides of the gem and include an invocation of Jesus along with magical words. Its style and the material link this to a large group of amulets engraved with magical inscriptions and images, which were made in the East, in Egypt and Syria primarily, maybe Asia Minor, which were very fashionable in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, although I think this is the only one I can think of with Christian images. They rarely admit Christian images. A recent article by the American scholar Roy Kotansky has provided a new interpretation of this difficult inscription as an invocation of the crossbeam of the redeeming Son. The language suggests an early Christian prayer, not influenced by the Gospels. So this is very likely a very early Christian object. It may date, I'd say it dates no later than the early 3rd century, maybe even earlier, and suggests that images of the crucifixion were already in use at this time. So I think it's one of the more important objects surviving from this period. So only tentative conclusions can be drawn from all of this archaeological tour of the few surviving early Christian monuments of the late 2nd and 3rd centuries. The allegorical and symbolic imagery, as well as the use of Old Testament images for exegetical purposes, notably as references to Christian teachings, very well reflects the rhetoric of contemporary Christian theologians, the writers. So the use of images for teaching very likely follows Jewish practices, as seen at the Dura Europos synagogue, and there may also have been both illustrated Bibles and commentaries on the Bible. Early evidence of Christian symbols, not only the fish and Good Shepherd, but even the crucifixion, is found in gems. By the beginning of the 3rd century, these practices has spread from Palestine and Syria through Asia Minor and to Rome. So what I'm hoping to say is that this very small number of very diverse objects is enough to prove that there was much more that we unfortunately do not have. So from these modest beginnings, Christianity gradually attracted converts from the Roman aristocracy, and soon after 300, the emperor himself, and that's when Christianity and its art was transformed. Thank you very much.